Thanks for the invitation to come and talk at the Harold Park Politics in the Pub. This is a familiar topic. It's familiar to me. I've spoken on this topic many times at Politics in the Pub over the years, but there's always a new angle. It seems to me Wynne in their introduction referred to the Trump phenomenon, which some see as resulting from economic inequality and a perceived divide between winners and losers, and therefore the need to shake things up, drain the swamp, get a new guy into the White House, as if that's going to solve the problem. More likely, it's going to intensify inequalities, not just in the United States, but more broadly internationally. So there are new challenges, there are always new challenges, but frankly there's enormous continuity in relation to this topic too. I'm going to argue a little later on that frankly inequality is as old as the hills, and certainly ever since the advent of capitalism as the global dominant economic system, it's structurally embedded in the normal functioning of the economic system, which is not to say that one can't make a difference. Inequalities sometimes widen, sometimes narrow. Thomas Piketty's important work, hardly summarised it in a very big fat book called Capital in the 21st Century, provides that data, showing, for example, that in the period after the Second World War, through the 60s, 70s, in most countries, including Australia, inequalities in terms of income and wealth narrowed somewhat, because progressive governments, progressive in all cases, but even under some liberal governments, such as the one headed by Robert Menzies here in Australia, the inequalities didn't widen as they had done under earlier periods of capitalism. And in some countries, income tax rates on high incomes were 90% or above. Unthinkable by modern standards. So in effect we had governments who were concerned with progressive redistribution and provision of public goods, public housing, public education that would help to rein in the natural tendencies of a capitalist economy towards ever greater inequality. And perhaps even more important, there was a strong labour movement which was fighting to ensure that workers got increased wages and shared in the fruits of technological progress and the higher levels of production and consumption that were occurring in that particular historical era. But over the last 3 decades, with the advent of neoliberalism, however that be defined, but as broadly understood, we've seen governments abandon that commitment to progressive redistribution. We've seen the labour movement weakened dramatically. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the innate tendencies of capitalism towards increased inequalities have had freer rein. The checks and balances are no longer there to the extent that they were in earlier periods. Now, has the system overreached? Has that produced outcomes that herald radical political economic changes, either swings to the left or to the right, to what some see as incipient forms of fascism in some cases? I'm not sure. My crystal ball clouds over at this point, but it seems to me it's an appropriate time to revisit this topic at Politics in the Pub, to take stock of what's happened and try to reflect upon appropriate political responses. Now, I'm also a member of the Greens, and some of you may have read in the newspapers, if you don't know from personal experience, that within the Greens, for example, there's growing controversy among whether the party should declare itself to be explicitly anti-capitalist. That's a move that's been pushed by some younger members within the Greens, and they're actually having a meeting at which I and Ventspie's Butcher and some other of the sort of academics within the Greens are going to be speaking about the nature of capitalism, and the question of inequality will loom large there too, as well as, of course, questions of environmental decay and social injustice. Because there are many within the Greens, always have been many within the Greens, who see the roots of these problems of environmental degradation, social injustice, economic inequality, insecurity, in systemic characteristics of the capitalist economic system. But having analysed the problem in that way doesn't necessarily lead to any clear political conclusions. What would it mean to be an anti-capitalist party? Would that involve a more traditional Marxist vanguard party? Or would it involve simply an attempt to, in the process of formulating reforms, and advocating and pressuring for reforms, trying to link those to a better structural analysis of the roots of the problem? I mentioned that within the Greens because I'm marginally involved in those processes, but it seems to me these are processes one would hope to be seeing happening within the Labour Party, within the Labour movement more generally, and frankly among all concerned citizens, trying to understand what's going on, to what extent redress of problems like inequality can be achieved through piecemeal reforms, or to what extent it ultimately requires a more structural, even revolutionary transformation of the way in which we organise ourselves for economic and social purposes. Here's a little slightly different take on the issues, which frankly I've tried to summarise in an article in the latest issue of the Journal of Australian Political Economy, which, as some of you know, I'm the coordinating editor of, and the latest issue is a special issue on global economic inequalities and development. Among the articles is one that I put together about the current state of play. I think it's reasonably comprehensive, but I want to actually make more explicit reference to another article that appears in this issue of Dept, and it's by two British political economists who analysed what the International Monetary Fund is doing about this situation. That's kind of interesting, and I'll explain why I think it matters. Christine Lagarde is the CEO of the IMF, effectively. Someone told me this afternoon that she first came to public notice as a member of the International Synchronised Swimming Squad for France. So I'm sorry to share that with you because I won't be able to think of Christine Lagarde without seeing an elevated body with a hand held high and a plastic smile on her face as she twiddles her feet to keep the top of her body above the plimsoll line. I hope people will listen now, said Christine Lagarde at the World Economic Forum in Davos last month. She was alluding to the wave of reactionary populism that's gradually sweeping the developed economies, and she was harking back to the speech she made at Davos in 2013 when she warned, and I quote, that inequality is corrosive to growth, it is corrosive to society. Now here's the head of a very conservative international institution. Some would describe it as a sort of a capitalist police force on national economies, particularly those who've got into debt, and the IMF bails them out on condition that they embrace neoliberal policies. So when Christine Lagarde talks about the need to consider inequality more seriously, I think some would say this is a very significant turning point. Cynics might say, well, she's just worried that if inequality gets really seriously out of hand, there'll be revolutionary challenges to the capitalist system re-emerging on the world scene. And so a sensible policeman knows when to give a little bit to the dissident forces. But I think a more sympathetic view would be to see, well, she just recognises that things have got crazily out of hand in recent times during this era of neoliberal dominance. But, as the article in J goes on to emphasise, the rhetoric isn't matched by the practice. A very careful analysis of what the IMF has done over the last few years suggests very little, if any, change. Even its criteria by which it applies loans to debtor countries have not dramatically changed. Indeed, inequality hardly ever gets a mention in the prescriptions of the IMF in practice. Now, you might say, as the authors of that article do, that this constitutes organised hypocrisy. A more sympathetic reading would be to say, well, it's one thing for the CEO to nail her colours to the mast, but it's another for the people within a large, complex institution who actually follow that lead. Anyone who's had experience of working in large organisations knows the problems of internal conflict, institutional inertia, and so forth. It takes a long time to turn a big ship around. But one way or another, it's clear that there's little change in the practice of the IMF from the policies which emphasise fiscal stringency, fiscal consolidation, in the attempt to increase the rate of economic growth, even if that means increased economic inequality is a consequence. So, the article concludes by saying, well, ultimately you can't look to these international institutions to solve the problems. No more can one look to the World Bank than one can look to the IMF. The action is all in practice within individual nation states. And that's, of course, where the dominant tendencies and prevailing policies typically are not auspicious. In Australia, for example, we've got Malcolm Turnbull speaking loudly from his harbourside mansion, speaking loudly in the Parliament this week to denounce Bill Shorten, because he also wants a harbourside mansion, but he wants it paid for out of the public purse. Whereas Malcolm, of course, paid for his own harbourside mansion. So what kind of debate is that in relation to inequality, I ask? And if you look beyond the rhetoric, what's the policies? Well, Turnbull's big agenda item this year is cuts to company taxation. And of course we're expecting further stringency in relation to welfare recipients, by fair means or foul. It's not an auspicious time to be expecting governments to embrace the inequality agenda. So there's this tremendous gulf that's opened up. A public concern which is soundly based. Equal societies tend to be happier societies. They tend to have less social problems. They tend to be better able to deal with environmental challenges. They tend to be more peaceful, and, as IMF research itself shows, they tend actually to have higher levels of economic productivity. None of which would be surprising, because if you have social cohesion, then you tend to get better economic as well as social outcomes. You get a better functioning political system. What we're observing is a breakdown of that happy nexus and a replacement by a growing schism between the interests of capitalism and the processes of democracy. The concentration of wealth and incomes is undermining the democratic capacity to pursue the necessary remedial policies. That's the paradox with which I want to bring my remarks to a conclusion. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion in which we try to work out what can be done to work with these contradictions and to develop progressive alternatives.
Thank you. Thank you very much.